Picture this with me. You have a seemingly perfect life, a beautiful home, a spouse, a couple kids, a job that takes care of all your needs and quite a few luxuries as well. One Tuesday morning, you're heading to work, but you have to come back because you forgot some important papers. Your kids are at school by now, so you expect to find your spouse at home alone, but when you walk in the door, you can't find them. You're just about to call out their name when you hear not one, but two voices. One is your partner's, but the other is unknown. They're both laughing, and the sound seems to be coming from your bedroom. You tense up as you fear the worst, and you instinctively grab a pair of scissors that are laying out on the table where your son had been working on a school project, and you head slowly to the bedroom door. You don't want to believe that this is possible, but as you slowly push the door open, you find the love of your life in bed with someone 20 years younger than you. Rage flashes in your eyes as your perfect life evaporates in milliseconds. Both of them go from shock to seeing you to begging as they see the scissors in your hand. You take one step forward and they both scream, pleading with you to not do anything rash. You feel oddly calm considering how much anger is boiling up inside of you as you take another step forward and another. You're now at the side of the bed where the two adulterers are cowering behind the blanket. You raise your arm above your head, scissors pointing down, and then you are tackled by someone who has just come running in through the door. Other heavily uniformed officers break in through your windows as you are tackled into submission. The scene is complete chaos, and now your life is over, and you didn't even commit a crime. You were the one being cheated on. But that doesn't matter, because you have been caught by the pre-crime division of the police, a specialized group that uses advanced methods to predict murder before it happens and arrest people who have not actually committed a crime yet. How's that for a Tuesday morning? I'm Jameson Olsen, you're listening to Becoming the Main Character, and today we're taking a big old bite out of Philip K. Dick's classic sci-fi short story, The Minority Report. Let's roll that intro, because it's about to get wild in here. Now, before we start the actual story, just a couple quick things. First of all, instead of doing it at the end of the episode, I'm going to do it at the beginning today. If you enjoy this show, if you've listened to multiple episodes and you have not done so yet, please give it 5 stars on whatever platform, or subscribe, like the video, depending on if you're on YouTube. Just do what you can to help the show grow. It doesn't cost you a dime. And now I want to give a brief bio on Philip K. Dick. He hails from a time where sci-fi was kind of like the TikTok of its day. Magazines would be published with collections of short stories or serialized novels with the most bizarre premises that most people could never dream up in 1,000 years. And while this is a classic story that was turned into one of the best sci-fi films of the early 21st century, if you've never heard of the name Philip K. Dick, you definitely know his most famous piece of work, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or as you know it by its film name, Blade Runner. Which, yes, of course, we'll get to that someday, but I needed a short story, so calm down. The 1950s were such an imaginative time for writers. We were doing just enough scientific discovery and invention to stoke their creative minds to come up with the most wild ideas, some of which were used in equally wild stories that may or may not go off the rails, but some, like The Minority Report, stick with us because they're just grounded enough to make us ask, what if? And after the story, I will share some thoughts on the 2002 Spielberg movie starring Tom Cruise, because I have a newfound appreciation for it 20 plus years later now that I know the source material and have revisited it with fresh eyes. Only thing I will say for now is if you have seen the movie, you probably clocked that my intro was based on the opening sequence in that film, which I think is an incredible opening 13 minutes. It shows you exactly how the world works without resorting to expositionary monologues. It just shows you. So, with that being said, here is Philip K. Dick's 1956 classic, The Minority Report. John Anderton barely looked up from his desk as the young man walked through the door. Taking in the striking features and eager grin on the young visitor made it painfully obvious to Anderton how old he was getting, as well as how bald and fat he was. "You must be Whitwer," he said as he stood up and extended his hand. "That's right, you can just call me Ed. I'm not much for formalities." Anderton tried to hide his annoyance. This kid was way too confident for his liking. He asked if he'd had any trouble finding the building, and Ed Whitwer, who answered as he strolled around the office without a care in the world, as if he saw this as his own office to get familiar with, told Anderton that he had no trouble since he already knew a fair amount about pre-crime and how it was run. "Oh, tell me. I would like to know how it's run myself." Whitwer chuckled and said in his view it's run very well, that the Senate has been very pleased with the operations of the pre-crime unit. Anderton had lit his pipe and was scrutinizing Whitwer as he puffed away. This guy was no fool. He was brimming with confidence and practically stunk of ambition. "I have been informed you will be my assistant until I retire," he said. "That's what I was told," Ed Whitwer said cheerily. "That may be this year or next or in 10 years. I founded this unit and I intend to stay with it as long as I want." Whitwer gave an accepting nod and said, "Of course." Anderton, feeling he could ease up a little bit, mumbled that he just wanted to make sure things were straight from the get-go. "You're the boss," was Whitwer's reply. John Anderton took his new apprentice for a tour of the offices that made up the pre-crime unit. He asked in an effort to confirm if Whitwer was familiar with the theory of pre-crime, and the response was this. Quote, "I have the information publicly available," Whitwer replied. "With the aid of your precog mutants, you've boldly and successfully abolished the post-crime punitive system of jails and fines. As we all realize, punishment was never much of a deterrent and could scarcely have afforded comfort to a victim that was already dead." "So you understand the legal drawback of this, as we are arresting people who haven't broken a law yet." "But they surely will," Whitwer replied with gusto. This kid was playing along at least. But was it true excitement to be in the role, or was he just sucking up to the man he intended to kick out of office one day? But for now, he continues talking about pre-crime, saying it's all about absolute metaphysics. "We claim they are guaranteed to commit the crime, they claim they're innocent, and because they haven't done it yet, they technically are, in a sense." They had finally reached the only truly interesting and unique part of the office that separated it from any other bureaucratic branch, the precog room. Surrounded by banks of equipment and data farms were the three precogs, all hooked up to so many wires that they were barely visible underneath them. "There they are," Anderton said dryly. "What do you think of them?" In the gloomy half-darkness, the three idiots sat babbling. Every incoherent utterance, every random syllable was analyzed, compared, and reassembled in the form of visual symbols transcribed on conventional punch cards and ejected into various coded slots. All day long, the idiots babbled, imprisoned in their special high-backed chairs, held in one rigid position by metal bands and bundles of wiring and clamps. Their physical needs were taken care of automatically. They had no spiritual needs. Vegetable-like, they muttered and dozed and existed. Their minds were dull, confused, lost in shadows. They were truly mutants to some degree, with withered bodies and larger than normal heads. They felt alien to Whitwer. For the first time that day, he didn't have a breezy smile on his face, but a twisted look of concern. He seemed shocked. "I didn't realize they were so..." He struggled to find the right word. "Deformed?" "Deformed and retarded," Anderton stated quickly. "Also, don't come for me if you don't like that word choice. This story was written in the 50s, and I don't think that using mentally challenged or any other form that's appropriate today really shows how Anderton felt about these beings. In his eyes, they're not human, they are tools." He goes on to explain that the more gifted the precog, the simpler their traditional cognitive abilities. "Donna over there," he said, pointing to the one female precog, "is 45 years old, but her talent absorbs everything. Her ability to make prophecies doesn't require her to understand them herself." Whitwer, still not recovered to his confident self, looked around the room, and he saw a large stack of printed cards and asked if that was the data that was collected from the precogs. "It is," Anderton said with a frown, admitting he hasn't had time to go through that batch just yet. Even as they spoke, more cards were popping out of the computer banks with fresh data from the precogs. "Based on the amount of cards, the precogs must see pretty far into the future," Whitwer said with a half smile, slowly gathering himself. Anderton told him actually 1 to 2 weeks is the absolute farthest they ever see, and that on top of that, most of their data was actually not even useful. He pulled the stack of unread cards and started filing through them as he explained many of the names given are useless, and of the ones that truly are committing crimes, most of those are petty crimes like burglary, tax evasion, assault, or extortion. "But, as I'm sure you are aware, Pre-crime has cut down on felonies by 99.8%. Word has gotten out, I guess, that if you plan on committing a murder or treason, we'll have you locked up in a detention camp a week before you had the chance to even commit your crime. Whitwer asked when the last murder had been committed at this point. Anderton told him it had been 5 years, with a note of pride in his voice. And even that, we had the name of the killer and the victim, we had all the right details, we just weren't able to get there in time to stop it. You must be very proud, Whitwer said. I am, actually, Anderton replied, puffing out his chest. I worked on this theory 30 years ago. I knew back then it would have a tremendous value to society. He handed the stack of cards to Wally Page, the man who was in charge of the precog room, telling him to sort this batch and let him know about which cards needed to be attended to. Already, new cards were coming out of the computer, and Anderton collected those as Whitwer asked a more interesting question. Are you ever tempted to, after all, I'm sure some of the people you pick up must offer plenty to... It wouldn't do any good, Anderton cut him off. You see, duplicate files are printed off at the Army HQ. We serve as a checks and balances system to each other. So even if we wanted to... Anderton trailed off. Whitwer saw him staring at one of the cards that had just come off the printer and asked if anything was wrong. Oh, nothing, Anderton said, folding the top card and discreetly stashing it in his pocket. He seemed flustered, and his tone was harsh enough that Whitwer ventured a guess. You don't like me, do you, sir? Anderton sighed before deciding honesty would be the best policy here. True, he admitted, but I'm not even sure why. But the truth is, in this moment, Anderton was dazed and wasn't capable of thinking clearly enough to give a good answer, because on that card he had folded and stuffed in his pocket, the name of the accused future murderer was his own. Pre-crime commissioner John A. Anderton. He was supposed to commit a murder in less than a week's time. Not a single part of him believed this could be true, but it did make him awfully nervous. They walked back into the office portion of the department to find Paige talking to Anderton's wife, Lisa. She is described as slim, attractive, and young. Now, to be fair, no one is given vivid physical descriptions in the story, but I do find it funny that Dick seems to fall cleanly into that stereotype of male writers who don't know how to describe a woman except for how hot she is. Lisa had been talking in an animated fashion to Paige about policy until her husband walked in. Hello, darling, she said as she walked over to him. Whitwer was silent as he stared at the woman in her police uniform. She was an executive official now, but Whitwer knew she had once been Anderton's secretary. And Anderton noticed this stare, and his frantic and suspicious mind already started putting some thoughts together that may or may not be true. To fake his name on a card would require some deep inside information, someone well connected in the department. Was Whitwer working with his wife? He landed on that being improbable, but still couldn't say it was impossible. While Lisa and the new guy introduced themselves, Anderton's mind raced. He knew he had 24 hours max before he would become a fugitive. The Army HQ would already have their copy printed out, but past experience had taught him that they were much slower to respond to their printouts. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of police sirens humming by. How long until one of those came for him? Lisa commented on how unwell he looked. He looked at her and told her he was fine, but as she and Whitwer continued talking, Anderton read the smiles on their faces as possibly being co-conspirators. Lisa invited the new colleague over for dinner, which John interpreted as an excuse to let the interloper into their home. He was constantly more panicked and constantly more suspicious of everyone. Anderton excused himself, saying he was heading back to the monkey block, which is a slang term for the precog room, something to do with the old see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. But he marched away, leaving Whitwer and Lisa standing there dumbfounded. His wife eventually chased after him, her heels clicking on the floor as she hurried to her husband. What's wrong? You're acting erratic, she said. She took hold of her husband's arm, but he immediately pried her fingers off, mumbling that he was going to get away while there was still time. What do you mean? She asked. He looked her in the eyes and firmly stated, I am being framed, deliberately and maliciously. This creature is out to get my job. The Senate is getting at me through him. Lisa was bewildered, saying he seemed like such a nice young man. Nice as a water moccasin, Anderton said with a sneer. His wife said her husband had just been under too much pressure and he needed to relax. Ed Whitwer was not trying to frame him. Ed? John said, shocked at the speed of her familiarity with the man. Well, that is his name, isn't it? After a pause, she realized this interaction meant that he suspected her being mixed up in it. She laughed in surprise. "You actually think I'm part of this?" His eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure," he said. "No," she said, staring at him. "You really do believe it. You do need to get away for a while. You need to rest. You're becoming paranoid. Do you even have any actual proof?" Anderton took the card from his pocket and held it out to her. The color drained a bit from Lisa's face as she gasped to see her husband's name printed so cleanly on the perpetrator line of the card. "This will give Whitwer legal pretext to remove me right now. He doesn't want to wait however many years until I retire. But more importantly, it will end the checks and balances system. We will no longer be an independent agency. The Senate will claim they are needed to watch us and will take over. They'll absorb the army as well." "I don't have any intention of killing him, though," he said, puzzled. He began spouting a plan about how he was going to pack and run away to a colony planet where they would never find him. But he had to move fast, and this was when his wife interrupted him to say, "Nobody says you're going to kill Ed Whitwer." He looked at her confused until she showed him the card and pointed to a line that he had been too flustered to notice until now. On line 5, where the name of the victim was listed, it did not say Ed Whitwer. The name said Leopold Kaplan. He took the card back and folded it into his pocket, feeling even more numb. He had no idea who this person was. Anderton went home and started packing. Maybe he was wrong about Whitwer, but he still could not shake the feeling that this was some plot. Why would he, a peaceful man who had never considered violence against another, the same man who had invented the theory that prevented 99.8% of murders, suddenly kill someone who he had never met? He was busy shoving clothes and supplies into bags as he cursed himself for even opening up to Lisa, since he still wasn't convinced that she wasn't in on it. She was probably describing their whole conversation to Whitwer right now. Suddenly, he heard a floorboard creak behind him, and he whipped around to see a heavy man in a brown overcoat standing there, with a gun in his gloved hand. "Did she even hesitate before turning me in?" he said out loud. The man looked confused. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said in a deep, gruff voice. "Come with me." "You mean you're not with the police?" The man said nothing else but just gestured with the gun, escorting Anderton down to the road, where a limousine was waiting, and drove off through the city into the countryside to what looked like a large mansion, but it was partially country estate, partially fortress. Anderton was marched, still at gunpoint, up into a room with luxurious furnishings. It was a study with shelves full of books, lit by warm lamplight. There was a man seated, his face partially obscured by the darkness, and Anderton was marched right up to him. It was an elderly man, maybe 70 years or older. He held a silver cane under his arm and wore a suit. He was mostly bald, but his posture and attitude felt very rigid. "Is this Anderton?" the man asked. The gun-toting thug confirmed that it was. The man looked at John and curled his mouth in disgust, asking, "What's the matter with you? How could you kill a man you've never even met?" In an instant, Anderton knew he must be speaking to Leopold Kaplan. "Do you realize what you've done?" Anderton said, feeling outraged at this whole incident. His precious time to escape was melting away from him. "I'm the commissioner of police. I could have you put away for 20 years. He opened his mouth to continue his rant until he stopped and decided to ask the real question that was bothering him. "How did you even find out?" The old man, also seeming angry and impatient, broke in, saying he didn't find out through the pre-crime agency, if that's what he thinks, and that he's not surprised that Anderton doesn't know who he is. He then introduced himself as Leopold Kaplan, General of the Army of the Federated West Bloc Alliance, and then, almost begrudgingly added, "retired since the end of the Anglo-Chinese War and the abolishment of the AFWA. Thoughts scurried around Anderton's head, so the army did process their cards immediately. They just didn't respond quickly unless it was important to them. "Obviously, I'm not going to kill you," Kaplan said, "or else it would have shown up on one of your little miserable cards already. Honestly, I'm puzzled. You intrigue me. The thought that a man in your position can consider murder feels off. There must be something more going on." Before Anderton could even open his mouth, one of the men in the room suggested it could be a deliberate plot, and Anderton jumped on the suggestion, saying that's exactly what was going on, that some coup inside the agency was setting him up so his new assistant could replace him, but that he had no intent to murder. "Well, I agree there will be no murder," Kaplan said, "because you'll be in police custody." "You're taking me back?" Anderton shuddered. "If I'm in custody, I won't be able to prove—" Kaplan cut him off. "All I care about is having you out of the way for my own protection." The man's face paused and looked almost compassionately at Anderton for a moment before shaking his head and reaffirming that he can't take the chance of getting involved. If this is a frame-up, he is sorry, but all he can do is wish Anderton luck. Take him to the police building and turn him over to Acting Commissioner Whitwer. Anderton was shocked to already hear the name of his saboteur having filled his shoes and wearing his title. Kaplan smiled a little and said, I'm afraid he's already making quite an affair of this. He turned on a radio as a bulletin was being read. All citizens are warned not to shelter or in any fashion aid or assist this dangerous marginal individual. The extraordinary circumstance of an escaped criminal at liberty and in position to commit an act of violence is unique in modern times. All citizens are hereby notified that legal statutes still in force implicate any and all persons failing to cooperate fully with the police in their task of apprehending John Allison Anderton. To repeat, the pre-crime agency of the federal West Block government is in the process of locating and neutralizing its former commissioner, John Allison Anderton, who through the methodology of the pre-crime system is hereby declared a potential murderer and as such forfeits his rights to freedom and all its privileges. Lisa must have gone straight to him, Anderton muttered. Take him to town now, Kaplan said. I feel uneasy having him this close. There was a light rain falling that rapped out a rhythm on the metal car roof as he was driven through the streets of New York City towards the police building. One of the men in the car was chatty and was trying to reason that if Anderton were in Whitwer's shoes, he'd act just as quickly, but Anderton just stared ahead, dead-eyed. He watched block after block fall behind them as they drew closer to his doom. The henchmen were still talking about how opportunistic this new acting commissioner seemed and asked if Anderton was sure that the man had been plotting for his job. He grimaced. Doesn't matter. But you claim the system is wrong for the first time ever? Isn't it possible if you say it's wrong now that it's been wrong before? It's possible, Anderton said listlessly. The truth is he was tired. He had been tired before Whitwer had even shown up, but in the hour since his arrival, his mind had been on high alert mode with the constant threat of being captured for a crime he wasn't planning on committing. Now that he felt it was a certainty that he was going to be captured, he was almost convinced to just accept it. All the cards were stacked against him anyway. The sharp squeal of tires cut into his thoughts, and the driver struggled to control the car. They hit the curb as he slammed the brakes. A massive bread truck had just crossed lanes of traffic in front of them. The car didn't stop in time, and it slammed right into the truck. Anderton was thrown forward against the seat in front of him, and he was immediately in a lot of pain. He was dazed, but he heard gunshots going off. There was silence for a brief time before hands roughly pulled him from the car. Dark shapes of men guided him through the overcast day into an alleyway. He could hear a man speaking, but wasn't able to discern the words at first. The man repeated harshly, impatiently. "Can you hear what I'm saying?" he said sternly. "Yes," Anderton confirmed as he looked at himself for the first time to assess any damage from the accident. He was covered in cuts and bruises. Looking at the man, he started to talk but was cut off by the large framed intruder who had just pushed Anderton up against a brick wall. "We had to stop them from grabbing you like this. It was the only way. We thought Kaplan would keep you at his place longer." The rain was dripping off the man's face as he grinned wryly at John. "My name's Fleming. You'll see me again, but the police are already on their way." He stuffed a packet into Anderton's hands and told him that this was all he would need to disappear for a brief time. It had false IDs, cash, and other useful information. "We'll be in touch until you prove your point," Fleming said with another smile. "So it is a frame-up?" John said, finally coming to his senses. "Of course," the man said. "You don't mean to say they actually had you believing it too?" "Don't kid yourself. They worked out every detail and had every phase under control. Why else would the card appear the very day Whitwer arrived?" "Who's behind it?" Anderton managed to ask. "Your wife," the man said. "Are you certain?" Anderton asked. "You bet your life. Now, get going before the police get here. Go down this alley, grab a bus to the slum section, rent a room, and do not leave. Buy a stack of magazines if you have to keep yourself busy. Don't try to leave Earth. They've got all the interplanetary transports watched." "Who are you?" Anderton demanded. But Fleming had already taken off in the opposite direction as the wail of sirens started to draw closer. "Consider us a protective agency," he heard Fleming shout back over his shoulder. After a few stunned moments, Anderton took off down the alley as he'd been instructed and unpackaged the ID. He was now Ernest Temple, an unemployed electrician who was pulling welfare from the state of New York to support his wife and 4 children in Buffalo. He read his info closer once he was on the bus. These documents had been made with him in mind. All the measurements and details matched him perfectly. There was also $10,000 in the packet. There was a typed message on a separate card that he read several times, unable to make sense of. Quote, The existence of a majority logically implies a corresponding minority. He got off the bus at a hotel in the slummy part of the city and booked a room with no further incident. He locked the door, drew the blinds, and turned on the radio in time to hear another bulletin about an escaped criminal. These were very rare these days, and so it was likely to draw the attention of the entire city. All citizens are warned not to shelter or in any fashion aid or assist the dangerous marginal. It's the same one we already read, so I'm not going to read it again. At least not this part. There's another part in a minute. But John lost track of the voice as he went into the bathroom to clean himself up. He told himself the next morning he'd go to a secondhand clothing shop where he could find himself an image that was more fitting of an unemployed electrician. He came back into the room and the bulletin was still going on about what feels kind of like a shameless bit of exposition, but I guess it is a radio broadcast trying to inform the public, and if you have ever watched a news station during a developing story where they're trying to talk nonstop, it's not far-fetched that they would review every detail of the situation in painstaking fidelity. But instead of reading the full bulletin, I just want to point out that the voice explains how the precogs work as a system for the first time in the story. We never get a true explanation of like how their gifts work. That's, part of the sci-fi of it all. But the way the system has been modeled is after early computer data systems, where data was verified by running it through multiple systems, because the only way to confirm the answer is if multiple computers found the same conclusion. But what if the first two computers disagreed? The simplest solution they had come up with was to have a third computer. Whichever response the third computer agreed with created the majority report, which is believed to be the correct answer. And finally, with a juicy piece that will make you impersonate that Leo meme of him sitting up and snapping his fingers at the TV, we learn that while a completely unanimous response between all three is hoped for, it is not very common, and that the odd computer out that comes up with a different response is what is referred to as the minority report. Haha, see, there it is. At this point, Anderton had already pieced together the idea that cryptic message about majorities implying a minority had to do with the reports, but it didn't give him any clue of what the report could mean. He had to see the minority report himself, which meant having to sneak back into the monkey block. He thought his only chance at getting in would be through the help of the one person he didn't suspect being part of the scheme, Wally Page, the soft-spoken gentleman who ran the monkey block. So the next morning passed with him going to find new used clothes, and getting some food before he called the police building and asked for Page's extension. "Hello?" the voice came from the other end. After a pause, Anderton just went for it, knowing that Page would recognize his voice immediately. "Can you talk, or are you busy?" The other end went silent until Page's voice finally came back. "Why are you calling here?" "How's your job?" Anderton asked. "You still safe?" "Wait a minute," Page said. John heard the sound of a man standing up from a chair and then a door closing before Page picked the receiver back up. "Now we can talk better. Where are you?" "I'm strolling through Central Park," Anderton lied. He hoped he could trust Page, but for all he knew, the man had stepped away to make sure a wiretap was working. Even so, he still had to risk it. "I'm in a new field these days. I'm an electrician." "Is that so?" Page said, baffled. "I wondered if you might have some work for me. If it might be arranged, I'd like to examine your basic computing equipment, especially the analytical banks in the monkey block." Page paused before playing along. "It might be arranged if it's necessary." "It is," Anderton said shortly. "When could I come by?" Page told him a repair team was already coming to look at their intercom equipment, and maybe he could shuffle in alongside them at 4 p.m. Entrance B, level 6. "I'll meet you there." "Fine," Anderton said. "I hope you're still in charge when I get there." The next 3.5 hours were the longest of John Anderton's life as he waited for his time to infiltrate the police building. When he reached entrance B of level 6, Page was there waiting for him. "You're out of your mind," he said in hushed exclamation. "Why did you come back?" "I'm not here long," he said as he scanned the area for anyone that might recognize him. He made Page stand guard of the monkey block as he went inside, but only after asking which of the precogs had made the minority report. Page pointed at the middle one, known as Jerry, and stepped outside without another word. Skipping over the several paragraphs where the author tries to explain in practical detail how Anderton accessed the minority report, I'm just going to jump to the juicy part. When he gets his hands on the report from Jerry, it's not entirely different. It did claim John would intend to commit murder, but that he would change his mind and end up not doing so. That Anderton's knowledge of the murder was enough to change his mind. Quote, prophylaxis had occurred simply in his being informed. But since the other two reports said he would commit the murder, Jerry had been outvoted. John, for a moment, had the thought that all he had to do was show this to Whitwer to prove his innocence, but then, quote, his own stupidity amazed him. Obviously, Whitwer had seen the report and was hiding it so he could move forward with his plan to take over as commissioner. He was debating in his head who he could take this to that would make any sort of difference when he heard a voice behind him. "You damn fool." He turned around to see his wife, Lisa, shaking with fear that he had returned to the one place where he would most certainly be caught. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm leaving." Her face was contorted with disbelief. "Page said you were here, but I didn't believe him." "You should listen to this tape before you do or say anything," he said as he held out the minority report. "I don't want to listen to it," she exclaimed. "I just want you to get out of here. Whitwer knows somebody's here already. He's probably figured out that it's you." "Can you help me? Can you distract him? Is there anything that you can do?" She paused for a moment, staring at the ground before saying there was a fully outfitted ship parked on the roof. "I'm supposed to be taking off in it soon, if you want to come with. It's a fast ship," she said. Anderton followed her, slightly reluctant, but knowing he had no other realistic options. As they walked quickly, she asked if he thought this had happened many times, a minority report superseding the others. He tried to say it could never have happened because he was the only one to see a report in advance like this. "But how many of them would have reacted the same way as you if they had been shown the report before they were arrested?" she asked. He didn't have a good answer to that question. She let him fly the ship, which made him feel a little bit better. She was shocked to learn that he intended to take it to Kaplan of all people, but he told her that that man at least would be interested. It's proof that his life isn't in any danger. "And you think he'll help you?" "Maybe," he said. "It's the best chance I have." "He might protect you," Lisa said. "He is pretty powerful." "Really? I thought he was just a retired general." "Technically, that's true, but he is the head of an unusual veterans organization. It's a collection of higher officers from both sides of the war. Together, they own quite a few assets." "What are you trying to say?" he asked. "Only this, John. You've convinced me that you're innocent, that you don't intend to commit murder, but those original reports weren't fake. Whitwer didn't set you up. There's no plot against you. If I'm going to accept that the minority report is real, you have to concede that the initial reports are also genuine." "I suppose so," he said reluctantly. "Ed Whitwer is acting in good faith. He is only hounding you because he thinks you're a genuine criminal. If he's guilty of anything, it's of being just as motivated to keep the peace as you have been your entire career. He wants to see the system continue." "Are you saying you want me to take this tape to him? He'll destroy it." "No, he won't," Lisa fired back. "He's had the originals in his hand from the start. He could have destroyed them at any time if he'd wanted." "Maybe you're right. Maybe he didn't know." "Of course he didn't," she said, getting upset. "And if you take that to Kaplan, you know what you'll be doing? You'll discredit the police. It will prove that the system is flawed and all your own legacy will be destroyed. If pre-crime is to survive," she hesitated, "you have to be taken in. Which means more to you, the system that you've created or your personal safety?" "My safety," he said without hesitation. "Are you sure?" she asked. "If the system can survive only by imprisoning innocent people, then it deserves to be destroyed. My personal safety is more important because I'm a human being. Anyway," he froze. Lisa had reached into her purse and pulled out a tiny pistol. "I've never used a weapon like this," she said, "but I believe my finger is on the trigger, and I'm willing to test it." He continued flying in silence for a time before clarifying, "You want me to turn the ship around? That it?" "Yes," Lisa said. "Back to the police building. I'm sorry, but if you could only put the good of the system above your own selfish—" "Keep your sermon," he snapped, cutting her off. "I'll take the ship back, but I'm not going to listen to your defense of a code of behavior that no intelligent man could subscribe to." She pursed her lips, but said nothing. He swung the ship around in such a broad arc that the two of them, who were strapped in, were fine. But it helped them discover that there was a third party on board who was not secure and was sent flying around the cabin. Anderton whipped his head around to see Fleming, the large man from the alleyway, being flung against the wall of the ship. Lisa turned to see the man and screamed as Fleming lunged at her, knocking the gun from her hands. Anderton was equally shocked, but kept his hands on the controls. Fleming was grabbing Lisa to restrain her before smiling at John, saying he apologized for not having popped out sooner, but he'd been listening, hoping that she would reveal more information. Lisa struggled against the man, but he was twice her size. Anderton quickly realized He must have been under observation from Fleming and his men since they'd freed him from Kaplan. Maybe you should give me the tape, the man said as he extended a sweaty hand. You were right, Whitwer would have destroyed it. Kaplan too? He asked. Have you not figured it out? Kaplan is working directly with Whitwer. That's why his name showed up on line 5 of the card. We can't be sure which of them is the boss. Maybe it's neither of them. I don't know why you ever got on the ship with this woman. We told you she was part of it. Lisa, looking terrified, cried out that it wasn't true, but Fleming just laughed darkly, saying she almost got away with it if it hadn't been for them. First thing we have to do is remove her from the picture. Fleming tossed his gun to Anderton and then reached both of his hands around Lisa's neck. She clawed and cried out, but his grip was firm. No bullet wound this way. People fall from ships all the time. The only difference is her neck will already be broken. Fleming was actively going for the kill, but it took Anderton a few seconds before he brought the butt of the military-grade pistol down on the back of Fleming's skull. The first hit stunned the man, releasing his grip on Lisa, but it was the second strike just above his eye that knocked him to the ground, unconscious or maybe dead. Lisa gasped for air, but Anderton asked her to take the controls while he pieced together what was going on through his head. He stared at the pistol he'd taken from Fleming. It was a newly developed military-grade pistol. These were very uncommon. He rummaged around the dead man's pockets for a wallet. He found an ID that said he was an Army major in the Internal Intelligence Department. Among his other documents was one signed by General Leopold Kaplan, stating that Fleming was under the protection of his group, the International Veterans League. Fleming's men were working for Kaplan? So they staged the breakout? Kaplan didn't actually want me turned in? Everything raced through his head, from when he was first picked up by Kaplan's men, the conversation at the Fortress Mansion, Fleming breaking him out. Everything Kaplan had done was to keep him out of the police's hands. So you were telling the truth about him, he said to his wife, struggling to believe that the bootlicking, overconfident assistant-turned-commissioner in a day was not playing some self-serving angle. Can you get a hold of Whitwer? He asked. Lisa called the man on the dashboard comm system. Whitwer's face appeared on the screen, and Anderton stood smiling at him for effect. Remember me? What happened, Lisa? The commissioner asked. Are you bringing him in? He seemed to be concerned for her safety. He was bargaining with Anderton to not harm her, claiming that she had nothing to do with this. I've already figured that one out for myself, Anderton said, looking over his shoulder at Fleming's body. He then asked if they could get an escort back to the police building because they may need protection. You're giving yourself up? The commissioner asked in disbelief. I am, Anderton said, almost not believing it himself. But you have to do something. Close the monkey block off immediately. Don't let anyone near it, especially Army people. Kaplan, Whitwer said in a shaky voice. What about him? John asked. He was just here. He just left. Anderton's heart stopped beating. He was picking up data, transcribing duplicates of our precog reports on you. He claimed he wanted it for his own protection. Then it's too late, Anderton said, defeated. What do you mean? Whitwer asked exasperatedly. I'll tell you when we're at the office, Anderton said, and disconnected the call. Whitwer was waiting for them on the roof of the police building when they arrived. Anderton walked right up to him. You can do what you want with me, lock me up if you will, but that won't be enough. Whitwer looked confused and out of his league. I never should have left the police building, John muttered to himself. Where's Wally Page? He asked. Whitwer said he was already detained and wouldn't be giving them any trouble, to which John said they were right to hold the man, but they didn't even realize the reason why, stating that Wally helping him sneak into the monkey block was not his true crime, but feeding information to the Army was. He puts the blame on himself, however, for never having figured this out in the years that Page had worked for him. Whitwer says he's reassigned the teams that were looking for Anderton to follow Kaplan, but they've noticed that he's barricaded himself in a building with military trucks and even a tank standing guard outside. He says it would start a civil war to try to get through all of that. Whitwer saw Lisa rubbing her neck and the body, maybe corpse, on the floor of the ship, and then asked if Anderton was ready to admit that this was not some plot of his design. I am, Anderton said. The acting commissioner wants Anderton to consider just following normal procedure. Just turn yourself in, and in a week's time, Kaplan will still be alive. Yes, but now Kaplan has all the information to prove that he would have been alive whether I was detained or not. The minority report proves the majority report obsolete. He has the power to break the pre-crime system, John said grimly. But why? Ed Whitwer said, still perplexed at what could be the deal that was going on here. After the war, the Army lost out. During the AFWA days, they ran the show entirely, military and domestic. They did their own police work. But after the West Bloc demilitarized, people like Kaplan were discarded. and nobody likes to feel discarded. Kaplan longed for the days when the military had the greatest part of authority in the country. You said he's won. Isn't there anything we can do to stop him? I don't know, but I'm going to study the tapes from the majority report to figure out exactly where and how I was supposed to kill Kaplan. It might give me some ideas. The first tape he watched belonged to the precog known as Donna. In this tape, Anderton was kidnapped just as he was in real life, but the interaction with Kaplan played out very differently. Anderton was given an ultimatum: disband pre-crime or face open hostility with the army. In that discarded timeline, Anderton had turned to the Senate for help, but they were quick to say they would rather side with Kaplan if it meant preventing civil war, and so in that first timeline, he successfully hunted down and killed Kaplan. But other leaders from the Veterans League survived and saw the coup through. Next, he looked at the tape from the other precog, Mike. Since they formed the majority report, he had assumed those two would be almost identical, but it wasn't. It was completely different. He rewound the tape multiple times to review because he was puzzled. An hour later, he came out of the monkey block with a confused look on his face. Whitwer asked if something was wrong, but Anderton didn't really give him an answer because he was lost in thought. All three of them became distracted by the sound of a crowd gathering in the street below. They looked out the window to see a small military parade, 4 columns of uniformed troops carrying flags from the war days, music playing, and a crowd cheering. I guess they're not going to even try to make a deal with us, Whitwer said. What do you think is his game? Anderton, who did not seem surprised by this, said Kaplan is planning to read the minority report to the crowd. He's going to discredit pre-crime with that report to claim we've been locking up innocent people for years. Do you think the Senate will go for it? I think they will, Anderton said. We're completely boxed in. There's only one way to proceed, and we'll have to take it. His jaw set and his eyes glinted, like a man determined to do the one thing that frightened him most. What is it? Whitwer asked. I have to fulfill the publicized report. I'm going to kill Kaplan. But, Whitwer stumbled, the majority report has been superseded. So, I can still do it now. He then makes his only request of Whitwer. Once this is done, he needs the new commissioner to pull strings to grant him exile to a colony planet instead of life in prison. That is his price for saving pre-crime. He hefted the gun he'd gotten from Fleming, indicating that would be his weapon of choice. You don't think they'll stop you? Kaplan will be surrounded by other military personnel. Why should they? They have the report that says I've changed my mind. So you're saying the minority report is incorrect? No, but I'm still going to murder Kaplan anyway. John Anderton had been police commissioner for 30 years, and he'd never shot a man. He'd barely even fired a gun on a range before. The idea of deliberate murder had all but been erased from society. But within 20 minutes, Anderton found himself approaching the grandstand that had been set up for a speech. The crowd gathering around it excitedly. This felt like something big was about to happen. Anderton slipped past civilians and chatting officers until he saw Kaplan, who was no longer dressed as the old and defeated civilian in a business suit. He was in full regalia, service bars and medals pinned to his well-preserved uniform, a visored cap and a decorative short sword on his side. The bald old man was completely transformed in this costume. Kaplan noticed him and walked over to him, saying, "This is a surprise," holding his gloved hand out to John. "I thought you'd been taken in by the commissioner." "I'm still out," Anderton said, shaking the man's hand. "Ha! Well, this is a great day for the army," Kaplan gloated. "You'll be happy to hear that I'm going to give a full account to the public which will prove you're innocent." "Fine," Anderton said. "It will be made clear that you were unjustly accused," Kaplan said, as if he thought John didn't understand what he was about to do for him. "Did Fleming have an opportunity to acquaint you with the situation?" he asked. John's eyes flickered for a moment. "To some degree," he lied. "You're going to read the minority report, right?" Kaplan nodded and smiled. "Yes, I'm going to compare it to the majority report." "You don't mind being used as an example, do you?" But before John could even answer, Kaplan looked up and realized it was time to start. He invited Anderton to sit behind him on the platform. "Why?" John asked. "So they can see the living proof, you and I together, killer and victim standing side by side, to expose the sinister fraud that the police have been operating." Anderton tilted his head and said, "Gladly." But something about his tone made Kaplan hesitate for a moment. He looked uneasily at Anderton and said, "You fully comprehend what I'm saying? This will have considerable repercussions. The Senate may decide to reevaluate the validity of pre-crime as a whole." "I know. Let's get started," Anderton asserted. He took a seat behind the podium, and Kaplan stood at the microphone to address the crowd. A hush fell over the street as the old general started to speak. "This man sitting at my side," he said, "is familiar to you all. You may be surprised to see him, because until recently, he was described to you as a dangerous killer." Everyone seemed to be locked on Anderton. This was the closest anyone in the crowd had been to seeing someone who had been named as a potential killer without them already being in police custody. "However," Kaplan continued, "in the last few hours, the police have called off his arrest order because John Anderton is innocent of any crime, past, present, and future. The allegations against him were diabolical distortions of a contaminated penal system that thrives off destruction of lives, grinding men and women to their doom." The crowd was captivated by every word from the general's mouth. He continued to undermine pre-crime, saying that even if precogs swear a man will commit a murder, to imprison him for something he hasn't done is false arrest. There is no valid truth of the future, he said. The very act of possessing this data renders the legal proceedings as invasive. Anderton was only half listening. In his coat pocket, his finger was stroking the pistol thoughtfully, his heart racing as he tried to remain calm. Kaplan had finished reading the minority report at this point and was already moving on to the majority report to show the contrast which would certainly turn this crowd against pre-crime. He unwrapped the majority report from its package and started to read, but very quickly a strange look came over his face. He stammered, shot a look back at Anderton as his lips began to quiver. The papers fell from his hands, and like a cornered animal, he froze for a moment before attempting to bolt from the stand. But as the general ran past, Anderton stood up, aimed the pistol, and fired. There was a small shriek out of Kaplan as he fell to the ground like a ruined bird. Anderton stepped forward, ready to fire again in case he needed to, but it wasn't necessary. No one knew what to do. A crime like this had not been committed, let alone witnessed, in decades. Smoke came out of the small hole in Kaplan's chest, and Anderton felt sick as he moved quickly to get off the stand. Even the military personnel seemed frozen in place, and the fact that this man held a gun and had already used it once meant no one interfered with his exit. The crowd was too stunned to be in a full panic yet. It was mostly murmurs and frantic whispering, but it would soon work its way up into a panic. But Anderton wasn't waiting around. He walked to a nearby alleyway where the police were waiting, and he turned himself in. He threw up in the back of the police vehicle. "The poor devil," one of the officers said. Anderton didn't know if he was referring to himself or Kaplan. An undisclosed amount of time later, 4 police officers were helping John and Lisa Anderton pack up their belongings before they would fly by space shuttle to Centaurus X. It would be a long trip for someone as old as Anderton, but at least he would never have to make the trip back. Lisa was just realizing that their atronic appliances would be no use there since Centaurus X still used electricity. "I hope that's not too much of an inconvenience for you," John said. "We'll get used to it, won't we?" Lisa said with a smile. He looked in her eyes. "You're positive you have no regrets?" "Because if you—" "No regrets," Lisa reassured him. And they closed up the last of the crates. As they climbed into the truck that would take them to their ship, Whitwer pulled up. The younger man looked pretty haggard, not the same beaming face that had strode into John's office not too long ago. He said he needed John to fully explain to him what had happened with the precogs because the Senate was pushing him for answers. They don't understand if the minority report was an error or what happened. Whitwer's best guess was that the minority report was just wrong. "Which minority report?" John said with a smile. Whitwer seemed to light up like he thought he might be getting it, but was still pretty confused. And so John began to explain in full context what had happened. There were 3 minority reports. The 3 reports were consecutive, not simultaneous, he explained. The first was Donna. In that time path, Kaplan told me of the plot, and I promptly murdered him. Jerry, phased slightly ahead of Donna, used her report as data. He factored in my knowledge of the report. In that, the second time path, all I wanted to do was keep my job. I didn't care about killing Kaplan. It was my own position and life I was interested in. And Mike was the third report, Whitwer said. That came after the minority report? It came last? Mike was the last of the 3, yes. Faced with the knowledge of the first report, I had decided not to kill Kaplan. That produced report 2. But faced with that report, I changed my mind back. Report 2, situation 2, was the situation Kaplan wanted to create. It was to the advantage of the police to recreate situation 1. And by that time, I was thinking of the police. I had figured out what Kaplan was doing. That third report invalidated the second one in the same way the second one invalidated the first. That brought us back to where we started from. Lisa was eager to get going, saying they didn't want to be late, and Anderton wrapped up his reveal. Each report was different, Anderton concluded. Each was unique, but two of them agreed on one point, that if I were left free, I would kill Kaplan. That created the illusion of a majority report. Actually, that's all it was, an illusion. Donna and Mike previewed the same event, but in two totally different time paths, occurring under totally different situations. Donna and Jerry, the so-called minority report and half of the majority report, were incorrect. Of the three, Mike was correct. Since no report came after this to invalidate him, that sums it up. Okay, that was a lot to follow. You probably got a gist of it, but just to nail down some of the details, he's saying, whereas they've assumed the reports always came in at the same time, and it was about if they could get the same answer, it just was a guarantee. He's saying these reports came sequentially. The first one, he would have actually killed Kaplan. But the second one showed him knowing he was supposed to kill Kaplan, which made him decide not to kill Kaplan. And then the third one from Mike, the one that he mysteriously was confused about in the precog room, and the same one that freaked Kaplan out when he opened it up on the stand, where it said he would be killed on the grandstand, was the real one because it was the only way he could save pre-crime. The truck started pulling away, but Whitwer still had one question, so he jogged alongside the truck as he asked, "Will it happen again? Should we overhaul the setup?" Anderton smiled and said, "It can only happen in one circumstance. My case was unique because I had access to the data, so it could happen again, but only to the next police commissioner. So watch yourself." He grinned at Whitwer, who stopped jogging at the thought of that statement. John leaned out of the window as they pulled away and said, "Keep your eyes open. It might happen to you at any time." Okay, before the lesson, that was a fun, quick story. Before the lesson, just a quick shout out to the 2002 movie Minority Report. I hadn't seen it in 10 or 15 years when I rewatched it this week, and I was so pleasantly surprised by what a great sci-fi flick it is. I've talked about this before, but I think short stories are the best material for film adaptations because they are long enough to establish a world, but short enough to give the directors and writers room to play with, instead of it all being about how can they cut down or change the longer novel into 2 to 3 hours. And I think it did a really good job of taking Dick's idea and running with it. I won't spoil much because it is different enough from this story, and I don't want to spoil it if you're going to go check it out. But the film is futuristic. There are all sorts of clever inventions that part of me wonders if they have taken those from other sci-fi stories of the era as an homage. A couple of my favorites, one of them is that in a world where lethal weapons aren't kosher, the police carry 6 sticks that are basically short cattle prods that somehow, when making contact, force you to vomit. Advertisers have built systems of retinal scanning cameras everywhere so that the video and holographic ads are completely tailored to you, with actors looking at you and calling you by name. And sadly, that one feels like the most probable of these types of inventions that we will see one day. I already mentioned how the opening sequence sets up the world so perfectly without resorting to long monologues. The movie will keep you guessing. It will make you think about the greater implications of a world like this. I don't know. In a world full of uninspiring adaptations, 2002's Minority Report is one of the good ones. Okay, now it's time for the takeaway from the story for your life. To me, this story is boldly asking one of those all-time questions: is the future fixed, or is it constantly evolving? In the Minority Report, people are not arrested because they had a thought to murder. They're arrested because the law has decided it's easier to assume once the thought happens, nothing will change that future, and it's just safer to enforce the law before anything can be done. They make the arrests because they have determined the future is stable. But it's not. In the context of the story, if the precogs were aligned, that was taken to mean a guarantee of the actions being predicted. But the disturbing thing Anderton realizes only from experiencing it firsthand is that new information can change outcomes. The future is constantly shifting as new developments take place. The future wasn't fractured because one precog got it wrong. It was fractured because the future itself evolved from one moment to the next. The future in this story is not a straight line. It's a feedback loop. Every layer of new knowledge may alter the next layer of reality, and any system that tries to predict certainty forgets that humans are reactionary and unpredictable. Now, I'm not going to spin this into some lesson where I say you should be open to all things at all times because you never know what's going to happen, because you do have to protect yourself to some degree so you're not taken advantage of. But this did get me thinking about how this looks in modern life, because we are increasingly more likely in this day and age to make fast judgments that are what we believe are fixed truths, immovable, and we should never allow them to be changed because that's predictable. That's what's safe. But that goes against one simple truth that we touch on in this show repeatedly. All change, especially the good kind, requires a level of volatility. Stability means nothing can change. So if you want to see improvements, you have to allow for different actions or ideas to have a shot. At the end of the story, Anderton said the only person that this scenario could happen to is the police commissioner because they have access to the data. Well, what if there was a world where all of the potential criminals were given notice that the precogs had clocked them as potential killers? How many people would change their minds because they knew the information that the police is basically withholding from the public? But even in our own lives, we prefer to act with certainty because vagaries in our life are scary. We'd rather predict what we think is going to happen, but it's not actually as simple as us just predicting, is it? Because once that prediction is made, our actions change. Our demeanor, the tone of our voice, our own choices all model the outcome that we have predicted, which means by virtue of us making a prediction, we become the greatest force in trying to make that future happen. Here's an example. Say your spouse has a habit that really bothers you. You've asked them to change it several times, and they may have made attempts, but ultimately they always return to their annoying ways. And say one day your spouse comes up to you and says, "Hey, I've decided I'm really going to try and fix it this time because I want you to be happy." Sounds great, right? But what goes on in your head? I've seen this before. They always let me down. There's no point in getting my hopes up because he or she is just going to fall back into their own ways after a couple of weeks. So there we have the prediction. But that's not the worst of it. Because what if your partner makes a genuine effort to change this time because something is different for them? But as they make improvements, your praise is guarded. You mostly stay silent to their progress because you don't want to act like you're being fooled by this doomed mission. Maybe you're even pessimistic enough that you go on to tell them to their face, "I'll believe it when I see it," which is the ultimate way to kill an improvement in your relationships, all in the name of self-preservation, in my opinion. And then, because they aren't getting any positive response that they were hoping for by making such an effort to please you, they let up, and eventually they do slip back into their old ways. And you are surprisingly smug as you hit them with a devastating, "I knew it," or "I told you so." But can't you see? While I'm not saying this is all your fault, because a relationship takes two, right? You have just played an active part in being an adversarial force to your partner changing. If you want real change in your life, your habits, your relationships, you have to accept that you need to be okay with some level of volatility and uncertainty. In that spouse situation I just outlined, you would have to think about how you could support them, even if you have your fears about them not really sticking with it. If you have tried to start a fitness plan 100 times and always failed, before you start attempt 101, you have to be volatile enough to believe that this one could work despite all previous efforts failing. If you want to find a better job, but you've been turned down by dozens of recruiters, you have to be almost delusional enough to tell yourself, maybe the next one will actually pan out. Believing that the future can hold certainties is like a corrosive blanket. We wrap it around ourselves because that certainty feels safe. But by clinging to it, we are letting our real potential to change and improve our lives be eaten up by cynicism and doubt. The future may seem probable, but there's absolutely nothing that can guarantee it 100%. For every statistical certainty, there are anomalies. For every rule, there are exceptions. Moving forward towards your ideal life is a balancing act of accepting the reality of your current situation and still having the audacity to believe that you can make something better in the future. And being open to the volatility it requires you to live with in order to achieve new heights. The moment you treat information as final, you have closed the door on allowing yourself or others to change, which is a tragedy because the future is not fixed. It's responsive. And You never know what single choice might change the entire trajectory of your life. And that does it for Philip K. Dick's The Minority Report. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back as soon as I can with the next novel. But for now, this is Jameson signing off from another episode of Becoming the Main Character. We'll catch you on the next one.